There's a reason your pastor doesn't preach on hell the way Eliot wrote about it. And it isn't because Eliot was wrong. Most sermons on hell do one of two things. They use it as a threat, the fire, the separation, the finality, to produce a decision at the end of the service. Or they quietly retire the concept, because the congregation is nervous about it, and nervous congregations don't come back. What almost no one does is what T.S. Eliot did. Go inside. Describe it from the inside. Name what it feels like when you're already there, and still breathing and still showing up on Sunday mornings. Eliot wrote 7 of the most precise descriptions of hell ever put into English. Not 7 arguments for hell. Not 7 reasons to be afraid of hell. 7 portraits of what hell looks like when it's wearing ordinary clothes. When it's sitting in a pew, measuring out its days. Going through the motions of a life that lost its center so quietly that nobody noticed, including the person living it. Pastors avoid this material because it's not comfortable. It doesn't resolve in an altar call. It requires looking at the people in the room and maybe at yourself and saying, this is a real diagnosis, not a metaphor. And Eliot was willing to do that because he'd been diagnosed by himself on the page. Over 40 years of poetry and essays that read, if you know where to look, like a man slowly naming the condition he was in. We're going to look at all 7. And by the end, I want you to understand something that the sermons almost never say. That naming the condition is not the same as being condemned by it. For Eliot, it was the beginning of the way out. Before we get to the 7, you need to understand what Eliot meant by hell. Because he didn't mean what most American Christians mean when they say the word. In 1929, Eliot wrote an essay on Dante that remains one of the most serious engagements with the Divine Comedy in the English language. In it, he makes a claim that most preachers would find uncomfortable. The Inferno, he writes, is not primarily a vision of punishment imposed from outside. It's a vision of states of being. The damned in Dante are not being tortured into something they weren't. They're being revealed as what they chose. The punishment, in Dante's logic, is the sin itself, carried to its completion. The frozen man at the center of hell didn't end up frozen by accident. He chose, repeatedly, the thing that froze him. Eliot read that and recognized it. Not as theology, exactly as phenomenology. As a description of how consciousness works when it turns away from the real, over and over, in small decisions that compound like interest, until the account is overdraft and the person sitting there can no longer feel the difference. That's what Eliot's hell is. It's not a place you go after you die. It's a condition you can inhabit before breakfast, and he named it 7 ways. The first thing Eliot knew about hell is that it looks respectable. The Hollow Men opens with 2 epigraphs. One from Conrad's Heart of Darkness, one from a Guy Fawkes children's rhyme, and then a portrait that has no dramatic violence in it at all. The Hollow Men are not villains. They are not raging. They are headpiece filled with straw. They have shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. What Eliot is describing is not the person who rejected everything. It's the person who retained everything. The shape, the form, the gesture. While something essential quietly evacuated the premises, the Hollow Men still gather. They still whisper together. They still perform the rituals. But the words don't mean anything, because the person saying them is no longer connected to the thing the words point toward. This is the hell no pastor wants to name from the pulpit, because it describes a significant percentage of any faithful congregation. People who know the prayers by heart. People who go because they've always gone. People for whom the service is a social architecture that stopped being a spiritual architecture so long ago they can't remember when it changed. The horror in Eliot's portrait is not the apostasy. It's the respectability. The Hollow Men aren't ex-Christians. They're the ones still showing up. The second thing Eliot knew about hell is that it's crowded. In the first section of The Wasteland, Eliot describes a crowd flowing over London Bridge in the morning commute, and reaches for a line from Dante's Inferno that most readers miss if they don't know it's there. I had not thought death had undone so many. In Dante, that line describes the souls of the uncommitted, those who, in life, never chose anything decisively enough to be held accountable for it. They are neither in hell proper nor in heaven. They are in the vestibule, stung by wasps, running after a blank banner that stands for nothing because they never stood for anything. Eliot puts those people on London Bridge, in suits, going to work. The second portrait of hell is the undecided life. The life lived at a safe remove from any commitment that might cost something. The person who kept all the options open, never burned a boat, never said, "I believe this enough to lose something over it." This particular hell is not dramatic. It produces, at the end of a long life, a specific kind of grief. The recognition that the years were spent in careful avoidance of the very choices that would have made them mean something. Eliot understood this from the inside. Before his conversion in 1927, he spent years in a no-man's land of religious skepticism. Too honest to pretend belief, too serious to dismiss what he couldn't believe. He was 48 years old before he chose. That wasn't weakness. But he knew what the years of not choosing had cost. The third thing Eliot knew about hell is that it lives in the gap between intention and action. The most quoted lines in The Hollow Men, and the most misunderstood, are these. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. People quote those lines to sound literary. What they describe is a specific mechanism of internal damnation. The person who intends, perpetually, to do the thing they never do. The conversation they're going to have with their adult child. The apology they're going to make. The faith they're going to actually inhabit instead of perform. The life they're going to start living once the timing is right. The shadow is not procrastination in the pop psychology sense. It's something structural. The gap that forms when the self that intends is disconnected from the self that acts. And the disconnection has been there so long, it's become the architecture of the personality. This hell is particularly cruel because it preserves hope. The person who lives in the shadow is always about to. They haven't given up. They have every intention. And so they never face the moment of reckoning that might actually move them, because they are sustained by the permanent promise of next time. Think of the person you know, maybe the person you are, who has been meaning to repair the relationship for 3 years, or restart the prayer life for 5, or have the honest conversation with the adult child for longer than they can quite remember. The shadow doesn't announce itself. It just falls. The fourth thing Eliot knew about hell is that it's comfortable. In Burton Norton, the first of the 4 quartets, Eliot writes a line that sounds like a gentle observation and is actually a diagnosis. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. This is the narrating as Eliot's framework extended into 2026, so let me be clear about what that extension looks like. Eliot wrote that line in 1936 in a poem meditating on time, memory, and the evasion of the present moment. He was describing a structural feature of consciousness. What I am saying, and this is my reading, not his words, is that the hell of comfort is the hell of choosing the tolerable over the true, repeatedly, because the true is harder to bear than the tolerable. The comfortable hell doesn't feel like hell. That's what makes it the subtlest of the 7. It feels like wisdom, maturity, acceptance. I've made my peace with it. I've accepted that some things aren't going to change. I don't need to understand it all. These can be genuine spiritual achievements. Or they can be the vocabulary of someone who stopped wanting reality because reality asked for something they weren't willing to give. The diagnostic question, and again this is the narrator's reading, not a line Eliot wrote, is whether the peace you've made is the peace of genuine surrender or the peace of managed avoidance. Eliot knew the difference. He spent years in managed avoidance before he learned to tell them apart. The fifth thing Eliot knew about hell is that it disguises itself as spiritual discipline. In Ash Wednesday, the long poem he wrote in the years immediately following his conversion, not a poem of triumph, but a poem of someone trying to believe against the evidence of his own feeling, Eliot writes a prayer that is honest to the point of being startling. Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still. That line is sometimes quoted as if it were an endorsement of spiritual passivity, the quiet acceptance of a person at rest. It isn't. It's a petition. It's asking for the capacity to care and not care in right proportion, and to be still in the way that genuineness requires stillness, as opposed to the way paralysis requires it. The fifth portrait of hell is the paralysis that calls itself patience, the waiting that is not surrendered waiting, but frozen waiting. The person who has been standing at the same crossroads for 15 years, calling it discernment. The prayer life that consists entirely of the same petition, offered the same way, with the same result, and called faithfulness instead of being examined. Eliot was not endorsing stillness as comfort. He was asking for the capacity to distinguish between the stillness that is full and the stillness that is empty, because from the outside, and sometimes from the inside, they look identical. The sixth thing Eliot knew about hell is that it hides inside sincere religion. This is the one that the pastors are most reluctant to preach, and with the best reasons. because it touches the congregation not at the edge, but at the center. And Eliot didn't write it as a poem. He wrote it as a speech, put it in the mouth of a 12th century archbishop facing martyrdom, and let it land with the full weight of a man who knows exactly what he's saying. In Murder in the Cathedral, Thomas Becket has resisted the temptations of power, pleasure, and the past. Then comes the fourth tempter, unexpected, offering something no one warned him about, the temptation to be a martyr for the wrong reason. To do the right thing, accept death, refuse to compromise, in order to be remembered, venerated, canonized. To use sacrifice as a vehicle for pride. And Becket says, in what is probably the most devastating line Eliot ever wrote, "The last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason." This is a portrait of hell wearing the vestments of sainthood, the person who goes every week for the community or the habit or the optics of being the kind of person who goes. The person who gives, because giving is part of the identity they've built and need to maintain. The person who stays in the marriage, raises the children in the church, tithes, serves on committees, and has never in 40 years asked themselves with brutal honesty, what is the reason I am doing this? And would I do it if nobody could see? Eliot knew this particular hell intimately. His conversion was followed, he later admitted, by years of going through the motions while the interior was catching up to the exterior. He didn't pretend the gap wasn't there. He wrote Ash Wednesday inside it. If this diagnosis has a familiar weight to it, and I think for some of you it does, in one of these 6 patterns, if not several, there's a companion to this video in the description. It's called The Second Half, Eliot's framework for life after 55, and it picks up exactly where we are right now after the diagnosis, with Eliot's own second half as the map. He named all of this about himself at 53. He wasn't done at 53. The guide is in the description when you're ready. The 7th thing Eliot knew about hell is that it ends quietly. The last line of The Hollow Men is also its most famous. Not with a bang, but a whimper. Everyone quotes it. Almost no one quotes what comes before it. The poem ends with the hollow men gathered around the prickly pear, the desert cactus that replaced the living garden, reciting a broken version of the Lord's Prayer that trails off mid-sentence. The kingdom, the power, the glory, they still know the words. They still say them, but the words are fragments, disconnected from the source. And so the world ends, not in catastrophe, in erosion, in the gradual failure of connection between the form and the substance it was supposed to carry. This is the 7th portrait of hell, and it's the one that makes the others cohere. The hollow life doesn't collapse dramatically. It whimpers to a close. The faith that was never examined goes cold so slowly that each individual moment of cooling is imperceptible. The relationship that was never honestly inhabited drifts to formality. The years that could have been the second act become the long diminuendo. And here is what the sermons almost never say. What Eliot knew because he'd been inside it. The line that ends The Hollow Men was written in 1925. In 1927, Eliot was baptized into the Church of England at age 38. In 1943, at 54, he published the 4 Quartets. Widely considered the greatest religious poetry in the English language, written during the London Blitz by a man who had named all 7 of these states from the inside and decided they were not the final word. And in East Coker, the second of those quartets, he wrote about the years before the conversion with honesty that strips all the romanticism off the story. 20 years largely wasted, the years of l'entre-deux-guerres. He wasn't performing humility, he was naming. The same act he'd trained himself to do with the poetry, the act that made the poetry possible. The naming wasn't the end of the hell. It was the beginning of something else. This is the thing that most sermons on hell refuse to say, because it complicates the theology. In Eliot's framework, the opposite of the hollow life is not the sinless life. It's the examined life, the life in which the gap between form and substance is not ignored but faced, not once in an altar call, but repeatedly in the kind of slow and honest attention that produces real transformation instead of performed transformation. The hollow men are hollow because they stopped looking, not because they stopped believing, necessarily, or stopped attending, or stopped praying, because they stopped looking at what was actually happening between the words and the meaning, between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act. Eliot did not offer a program for fixing this. He was a poet, not a therapist. What he offered was precision, the most precise language available for what the condition feels like from inside. in the hope that the person who recognizes themselves in the description might stop calling it something else. Might stop calling the hollow peace. Might stop calling the whimper a restrained and mature quiet. Might name it what it is the way he named it what it was and start from there. He was 68 years old when he married Valerie Fletcher, by all accounts in genuine joy. A joy he said he had never expected and could not have manufactured. 68. After the first marriage that he described as a catastrophe, after the 20 wasted years, after the conversion, the blitz, the long discipline of the Quartets, the question that stays with me, and that I suspect stays with some of you, is not whether any of these 7 patterns apply. It's what you do with the recognition. That's smaller than it sounds, and harder. If you've recognized yourself in one of these 7 patterns, and I think most of us recognize at least one, tell me which number it was. I read these. The companion guide, the second half, Eliot's framework for life after 55, is in the description below.